World War II is a setting that has been done almost endlessly in video games. It feels like we've seen the D-Day landings a dozen times over the past decades. You've got the Battle of the Bulge, which is often a staple of the shooter genre. There's the desperate, deadly defense of Stalingrad, the fall of the Reichstag. The list goes on and on. They're all key touchstones, almost regardless of the medium through which we view this war, but they also dilute just how global it was and how many countries and people were caught up in its clutches. The breadth of the conflict was something that DICE really sought to explore in Battlefield 1's rendition of World War I, grounding each of the short stories that they told with an interesting narrative hook and bringing diversity in the settings and the battles that they chose to depict. But with World War II sitting much higher in the public consciousness, it makes it feel much more difficult to pick out the stories that haven't yet been told, even if you are just taking 1 or 2 steps away from those 5 or 6 most famous battles. And yet DICE managed to make it look easy, again leaning on an anthology format to bring certain battles to light and make each moment and story stand on its own, even taking the time to experiment with each one in how they tell the tale. So, as with Battlefield 1, it starts with a prologue that hops from one perspective to another, but instead of the futility of defending or assaulting a particular line on the battlefield, it's all about the scope of this war. You hop from fighter pilots trying to take down an incoming airstrike to tanks in North Africa, and then to paratroopers desperately trying to hold their ground during Operation Market Garden. As a showcase of the war as a whole, it is an impressive compilation, especially just because of how seamlessly it shifts from one to another. But for me, it really lacks the undercurrent of emotion that Battlefield 1's prologue had. That does seem to carry through to the stories that I experienced and played snippets of from during the event. The closest in terms of that thematic emotional impact comes in Tiralur, as African soldiers from the French colonies are drafted in by their military to try and help retake that country in Operation Dragoon. As much as World War I relied on the colonies of each empire across the world to provide soldiers and resources, so too did World War II. But even as these French colonial soldiers step off the boat to fight for their country, that doesn't make them equals in the eyes of the French. This is painted as a fictional story within the historical setting, as Deme and his unit are thrown into battle by a prim and proper general. They're effectively used as cannon fodder, and I can really see that the later chapters in this story are going to have that real impact that I would like to see here. Under No Flag is definitely one of the stories that is not too heavy on the emotions, with the criminals and misfits thrown together in the special boat service. By contrast, this is much more light-hearted, more outright fun and action-packed, with Billy Bridger, a convict that is drafted into the unit, and he's constantly wisecracking, making his own improvements to the equipment that they're using, to greater or lesser success, as they go on a covert raid into North Africa. It is rather unbelievable, however, that he would be thrown right into the action with seemingly no training outside of the criminal activities that he had in the UK, but it does help to add to the fun banter and the action romp style of this story. A key focus has been in making sure that most, if not all, scenarios can be played in your own particular way. That is most apparent in the stories where you're given stealth as a real option, where the objectives are spread out before you, as in the climax of the Nordlist story in Norway. Here, most unbelievably, you've got a lone Norwegian resistance fighter battling her way into a German-held industrial facility, dealing with the harsh, freezing conditions of her country when the mission takes a turn, and then single-handedly managing to dismantle the export of heavy water. There's some great moments here, such as when skiing to escape a facility, when struggling to survive, going from one fire and one building to another, and looking over to another screen of someone else that was playing, I saw them going on a bit of an axe-murdering spree compared to my shotgun-toting romp. And then there's just the freedom to tackle a sprawl of objectives in an order of your choice across quite a large map. It's a little bit Bond in a number of ways, I think, with a sensationalist take on the combat and the freeform design really allowing you to go for the distinctively bombastic battlefield play that often occurs online. Most intriguing, and in what is possibly a first time for a mainstream World War II game, one of these stories will actually include a German perspective, following a tank crew through the final stages of the war in what's called The Last Tiger. As you might be able to figure out, it's not about a tiger, but instead about tanks, and tiger tanks were utterly dominant on the battlefield. They might have been few in numbers, but that did nothing to diminish the fear that they would instill in their allies, forcing them to change their tactics and even withdraw if they saw them. However, as promising as that sounds, playing characters that aren't the good guys and being presented with the consequences of their actions, it won't be there at launch. It follows in December as the Tides of War first season kicks off. And this is partially because DICE want to keep on polishing this episode and the game as a whole a bit more. If there is one thing that I'm wary of after playing all of these little snippets of single player, it was the number of little bugs and issues that I ran into. Now, DICE are a big studio, and squashing bugs is always the final stage of development, and it is completely to their credit that they were willing to show such a wide selection of episodes and moments from the story. But it does feel like they are running this game really right down to the wire as they develop it in terms of how features and plans have changed over the last few months. I really hope that it's an unfounded concern because there is still real promise in these stories and the settings that they've chosen. Despite being set in the overly familiar ground of World War II, Battlefield 5 does feel like it's taking risks in the stories that a single player looks to tell, and also how it tells them. It's something that was, in my opinion, one of the best aspects of Battlefield 1, and DICE trying to deliver that with more consistency and within a much better known conflict could again be one of the real highlights of their latest game. As always, thanks for checking out our video. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it a little bit useful. We have this preview over on thesixthaxis.com, as well as an interview with Daniel Berlin, who is the franchise design director at DICE, where we talk about not just the single player but also multiplayer and how DICE are talking to the community. It's a really good read, and I hope you go and check that out as well. Before you go though, please do like, subscribe and share, and hopefully we will see you again soon. Goodbye!
Den metalldøren.